to disturb the peace of Howard Beach. I have to admit, I persuaded Breslin to take the Concorde home from Europe to New York. We were hoping for his column for the first edition of the paper. A spokesman for British Air called and said, "The good news is the plane has landed. The bad news is it landed in Halifax." Over the wire came a telephoto of Breslin leaving the disabled plane at the Halifax airport. The photo was black and white. Breslin was green. There was also the time his muse had flown. This was not, all that occasional, but as deadline approached, he was staring helplessly out the window at 42nd Street. And slowly, his head began to turn as he overheard Anne-Marie Caggiano, don't call her his secretary, fighting on the phone with her boyfriend. Not only was a column born, but a book. Or when we were drinking at the Gotti Bar on East 40th Street with Terzi, the Palestinian UN delegate. Terzi was lamenting the firing of Andrew Young. The conversation provided an enduring lesson for me about politics. Never put principle over a job. And of course, the famous Son of Sam letter, which has been mentioned, which was addressed to Jimmy, but he never actually saw. Murray Kempton once wrote that the first recognition by intellectuals of Breslin's emergence as a moral force was in Portnoy's complaint. The monkey cries out, "I'll expose you, Alex. I'll telephone Jimmy Breslin." And she's crazy enough to do it, Philip Roth wrote. Breslin, that cop, that precinct station genius. To watch Jimmy Breslin in a new place, Kempton continued, was to live over in a week the education that had taken most of our own life. Jimmy has taught me so much, and I am so grateful. Thank you.
The next fellow, as the cliche goes, needs no real introduction, but he's probably the best read sports columnist in town. He's written many books. He's known Jimmy since his first days in the New York newspaper scene. Please welcome Mike Lupica.
I wrote a column about the guest of honor yesterday, which I told so much of what I think about him, and then I called him this morning mostly to make sure that he was still coming. He gets on the phone and he says, "I suppose I'm supposed to thank you." Well, I said, no, that's not actually why I called, but it occurred to me that the reason he thought he was supposed to thank me is because of the person who really should be the co-honoree tonight, the great Ronnie Eldridge, Mrs. Jimmy Breslin. A long time ago, when Ronnie called to tell Pete and I that she was going to marry Jimmy Breslin, Pete said, "Does this mean you've officially ruled out adopting him?" I met Jimmy Breslin when I was in college, at Boston College, writing for the Boston Phoenix, which was the Village Voice of Boston. I'm sitting there in complete obscurity one day, and the phone rings, and I pick it up, and the voice at the other end of the phone says, "This is James Breslin of New York City." And I thought it was one of my friends playing a cruel practical joke on me. It was him. He said, "Yeah, Bellows," the late, great Jim Bellows, "is looking for a young guy to write some pieces for the Washington Star. I heard about you. I'm at Charlie Daly's house in Cambridge. Bring some stuff over." This, as you can imagine, is in the days before Google and printing out your work. I jump into my Volkswagen, I drive back to my apartment in Brighton, Mass., and I assemble my pathetic collection of clips. There's like 12 pieces. And I'm going to go present these to Jimmy Breslin. Except, as I'm about to leave my apartment, it occurs to me I have no idea who Charlie Daly is. I call the Cambridge Police Department. I said, do you know anybody named Charlie Daly? Well, it's Michael's dad. He was a vice president at Harvard. They give me direction. I go to this house, and I've got my little clip folder with me. He answers the door. He says, where is it? So I hand it to him. And I'm telling you, there's 12 pieces in here. This is my whole life. He sits down at the dining room table, and he starts to go through them. And I'm thinking, please like one of these. He goes to like 8, and I think, well, there's other things I could be a jockey. There's a lot of things I could do for a... He finally gets to number 11. He said, this isn't bad. Send this one. And that was really the beginning of it for me. Jim Dwyer brought this book up. I've carried this book around for 40 years. This is my ticket to this event, The World of Jimmy Breslin. I read it when I was in high school. And I opened it up, and I read about all the people you've heard about tonight. Klein and Marvin and Fat Thomas and Robert J. Allen and about the Gravedigger and Death in Emergency Room 1. And I said, oh, okay, this is what I'd like to do for a living. And what you know from the first time you read Jimmy Breslin is what you know about greatness in any field. And that's that what he was doing was always different from what everybody else was doing. And now I was in his world. I didn't know that meant you were going to be on 24-hour call for the rest of your flippin' life. When my children were smaller, we'd go down to Florida for spring training and spend the entire time down there. And Carl Hyacin had told me this, but I found out firsthand that the most dreaded words in the English language were, yeah, I'm thinking of coming down there. What has not been discussed here, Mr. Breslin cannot drive a car. So what coming down here meant, which sounded harmless enough, wasn't for fellowship or this bizarre mentoring program that he's had with me for 40 years. What it meant was he wanted me to drive him around. I would later say to a mutual friend of ours, I really think, Jimmy really liked me from the start. And the friend said, no, what he mostly liked about you was that you had a valid driver's license. I will tell you, everybody has told their favorite Jimmy Breslin story tonight. And it's a way to know not just what an amazing presence he's been, but how much fun it has been to know him. This was the occasion of my 40th birthday party. And it was a surprise. And Pete was in on it. My wife, Taylor, was the other unindicted co-conspirator. And I really thought that I was just going down to have dinner with Pete and Fukiko in the village. And then I walked into a room next door to Pete's apartment, and it was everybody I knew and everybody I'd ever known. And it was one of the great nights of my life. And at the end of the night, it's time for the toast. And Pete speaks, and family members speak, and friends of mine speak, and finally, the last speaker is my hero, Jimmy Breslin. And he was fantastic. It was like the greatest stand-up comedy you've ever heard. People are laughing and stamping their feet and cheering and begging for more. And about 10 minutes into it, I turned to Pete and I said, have you heard my name come up at any point in the... And Pete said, nah, but he's on a roll. that role continues to this night. Jimmy, I can't imagine what it would have been like not to know you. God bless you.
Our last speaker before we get to the main event is one of the best writers in America, for my money, our Jonathan Swift, who can make you laugh about the most serious stuff ever without resorting to teenage vampires or any of that kind of stuff. He's also a brilliant journalist who has a wry way of looking at the world. For example, about almost 30 years ago, he went down to the Cayman Islands to write a piece for the Miami Herald, where he writes a column still. And he was gone about 10 days, and I called him when he got back, and I said, "How was it there in the Cayman Islands?" And he paused for about 10 seconds and said, "Well, it's the kind of place where they point out the honest people." And I knew he had the eye of the novelist. And if you have never read any of his novels, go buy any one of them. They're all equally good. Please welcome Carl Hiaasen.
As you might have guessed, I'm not a New Yorker, and I didn't grow up reading Jimmy Breslin, but I grew up hearing about Jimmy Breslin. He was the distant voice, and when I became a journalism student, he was one of the icons, along with Pete and Mike Royko and Murray, and there was Jimmy Breslin. And I went to work at a small paper, and then finally wound up at the Miami Herald, and I remember one of my first exposures, and it was one of those 3 stages removed from actual Jimmy Breslin. There was the incident at 3 Mile Island, as you all remember, when we all thought the nuclear plant was going to explode. This was back in the days when the Herald and a lot of other newspapers actually put people on airplanes to go cover stories instead of Googling stories. So the Herald actually sent some warm bodies to 3 Mile Island. I wasn't one of them. But one of them was a fellow named Pat Malone, who was a friend of mine. And I remember being in the newsroom when Pat Malone called, very excited, from 3 Mile Island. And it hadn't blown up, but he was on the phone dictating his notes, his reporting notes, to his editor. And I was sitting nearby, and here's what Pat said to his editor. He said, "Jimmy Breslin." He said, "Jimmy Breslin's here." I said, "Jimmy Breslin's there?" He said, "Yeah, he's standing right behind me here at this payphone." "Well, that's great. He's writing down every word I'm saying." The first time I met Jimmy Breslin was, again, indirectly through the Hamels, through Johnny and Dennis and Pete, and a fellow in Miami named Alvin Malnick, who at that time was widely described in the Miami Herald as the heir apparent to Meyer Lansky, the great gangster. Alvin Malnick's Rolls Royce blew up in his driveway, and his version was sort of like the Tiger Woods version of "I really don't know, it just blew up." The next thing I knew, nobody believed that. But somehow myself and another reporter Malnick had never been interviewed by the Miami Herald in 30 years of covering this guy. And if you are really the heir apparent to Meyer Lansky, you don't give a lot of interviews because Meyer was still alive at this point. You didn't want that phone call. So anyway, but somehow we had finagled an interview with Al Malnick. And it was to take place over 3 different sessions under very strict conditions in this apartment he had, in which he was going to deny being a gangster or having anything to do with Meyer Lansky. That's fine. Well, I get a call from, I think it was either Dennis or Johnny or somebody who said, "You know, Jimmy Breslin wants to come down. He's doing a column about Malnick and about the Rolls Royce blowing up and everything." And I thought I'd have a chance to meet you. This is fantastic. So Jimmy said, I get him, Jimmy, we talk on the phone, I'm all excited. Jimmy's coming down. He said, we got to pick a spot, we got to talk, we got to meet a guy. And I said, well, who are we going to meet? And he goes, we're going to go meet Seymour the Pirate. Seymour the Pirate. I had never interviewed Seymour the Pirate, and like any young reporter, I went to the Miami Herald clip file, and I looked under Pirate, and I looked under Seymour, and there was no intersection of those terms. But I thought, if Jimmy says it's Seymour the Pirate, by God, we're going to meet Seymour the Pirate. So I pick a hamburger joint on Fort Lauderdale Beach, and I don't know how I ended up there or why we picked that, but it was some choice between Seymour and Jimmy had decided on this. And so Jimmy says, "I'll be there." I said, "What kind of car are you drive?" He said, "I don't drive, but someone will be driving me." So I'm standing with my notebook, and it's a hot day, Fort Lauderdale Beach, and I'm looking, and his car is coming down the road, and Jimmy had brought one of his sons, and I'm not sure who it was, to do the driving. The car wasn't exactly going in a straight line, but Jimmy was hanging out the window with his notebook. That's how I recognized him. It was my first sight, Jimmy Breslin on Fort Lauderdale Beach, and I waved to him, and we stopped. I brought him inside, and sure enough, Seymour shows up, and Jimmy keeps calling him Seymour the Pirate to his face. Seymour was tangentially involved with what you would call organized crime, I assume, in South Florida. I didn't know if that was the proper way to address him. And he kept saying, "Jimmy, quit calling me Seymour the Pirate." He's getting like pissed over his cheeseburger. "Stop calling me Seymour." So Jimmy just drills right in. I'm not saying anything. I'm learning. I'm at school here. I'm going back to journalism school. And Jimmy's drilling in on Seymour the Pirate about Alvin Malnick's Rolls Royce. And I don't know anything about Al Malnick. Please don't put me in the column about Al Malnick. It's clear he wants nothing to do with anybody associated with Meyer Lansky, and can you blame him? And Jimmy puts forth a theory that Malnick had guard dogs at his, and he did have some guard dogs, and Jimmy put forth a theory that perhaps the guard dogs were defective if they let the perpetrators of the Rolls-Royce bombing onto the property. And he offers this up as a theory to Seymour, whose face, the blood is draining from his face. He goes, "You're not going to put that in the column, are you, please?" By the end of the lunch, Seymour the Pirate is begging, "Jimmy, don't put me in another goddamn column. Don't do it. Don't you dare put me in the column." We have lunch. Jimmy hugs him. "Bye, Seymour." I say, "Bye, Seymour." Off we go. Well, apparently the column comes out because, and it comes out in such a way that Alvin Malnick, who normally doesn't make phone calls, is now having second thoughts about sitting down with the two journalists from the Miami Herald based on a column that ran in New York City by Mr. Jimmy Breslin. He would like to know, in my case, do I know Jimmy Breslin? Have I ever spoken to Jimmy Breslin? And I said, "I've never met the man, but I know his reputation." Here's another interesting thing. About not less than 2 weeks after that column ran, Alvin Malnick got on a plane for Saudi Arabia and did not come back to the United States for 5 years. I don't know if Jimmy had anything to do with that. But if so, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami was grateful, if nothing else. I'm just going to end this with one lesson. And this is something that I've always tried to remember. And I've talked to many journalism schools and many students, and they always ask you, not just about column writing, but about journalism altogether, about what we do every day when we sit down and stare at the blank piece of paper, or in this case, the blank computer screen. And I remember one time Jimmy told me something, and it's what I always hit myself over the head with every time I'm stuck or every time I'm editing myself or rereading something. And he said, the worst sin that any reporter can commit, any writer can commit, is to be boring, So I am very honored to be here to celebrate the life and career of the least boring writer in the world, Jimmy Breslin.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy Breslin.
I'll start by saying the evening is a fraud. I'm no good and I can prove it.